This series is about humans and alcohol. It's about how we've interacted with alcohol over time and how this has shaped the world. My name is Professor Phil Widdington, and I'm a historian at the University of Sheffield in the UK. Over 6 episodes, we will be taking you on an enormous journey looking at key moments in the history of alcohol. And when I say enormous, I mean very large indeed, to the tune of thousands of millennia, which is why I need the help of my colleague, archaeologist Dr. Nick Groat.
I'll be leading you through our first moment, which spans about 80,000 years. But this isn't typical. Our future moments are considerably shorter, taking us from the world of classical antiquity to the present day. And if you're wondering what half a moment is, you'll have to wait till episode 6.
But first, a lesson in homebrewing. Alcohol is pretty easy to make. You need a sugary base and some kind of yeast to break it down through fermentation to produce ethanol, an intoxicating chemical that has a range of effects on us, the drinker.
This can happen spontaneously as yeasts are present in the very air we breathe. And when they meet a sugary source, ethanol is naturally produced. For instance, we've all heard about animals getting drunk on eating rotten fruit. Humans, however, learnt to brew alcohol intentionally and drink it on purpose.
The consequences of this are huge. The humans who first learned the secrets of fermentation created a substance that across time has exerted a powerful influence on human societies.
Fermentation was part and parcel of making food digestible, and so inevitably our early ancestors would have had some familiarity with consuming alcohol.
People began to copy the nitro process. So that is the beginning of alcohol production.
So here you've got a really intriguing mix of human remains and a grape liquid. Potentially there's ritual activity, we could say. Something extraordinary is going on in that cave.
In this first episode, Nick is going 80,000 years back in time to find out how and why humans joined up, settled down, and started brewing.
I'm standing by a compost heap at the bottom of a garden in Sheffield, and in front of me is a mass of rotting vegetation. I can see dead leaves, grass cuttings, old vegetable peelings, lots of mulch really. It's breaking down quite nicely and doesn't really smell, but what on earth am I doing here? Why is this remotely relevant to the history of alcohol? Well, according to Professor Martin Jones from the University of Cambridge, rotting vegetation is where it all began.
I'm an archaeologist of food, and I'm interested in all aspects of food, not just food as something which is nutritious, but something that binds us socially. In my career, I've looked at various things from rubbish pits through to ancient genes, but all looking at the archaeology of food.
Professor Jones has been researching why humans first experimented with fermentation and when our ancestors started to eat fermented foods.
One of the really useful bits of evidence is our own bodies. As a mammal, I have a larger brain than average, but if you look towards my gut, I have a much smaller gut than average. Most mammals have a very big gut and a smaller brain. There's a hypothesis about this called the expensive tissue hypothesis, which suggests that in evolution, we can only afford one expensive organ. And so if the brain is going to get bigger, then the gut has to get smaller. Our brains certainly got bigger during human evolution, and we can see from the end result our gut got smaller.
Professor Jones thinks that because early humans developed smaller stomachs, the food they ate, which was things like plants, roots and leaves, needed to be partly digested before they swallowed it. He calls this external digestion.
Today, we do that through cooking. And we know that for tens, hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors have done that through cooking, and we can find their fireplaces. However, we know the time scale at which our stomachs got small is much longer than that. We've only had cooking and the controlled use of fire for about 1/10 of the time that our hominid brain has been getting larger. So there must be some other form of external digestion, of digestion outside the body, that our predecessors were using to achieve that end. Now, if we look at what early hominids would be good at, we can look at other primates and see how they engage with nature. And our close relatives are very good at learning about their environment, at learning about their ecosystem, and they're very good at watching and waiting. And there are several examples where they will watch and wait and choose a time to consume their food. One of the things that one can watch is natural process of breakdown, in particular fermentation. And a strong candidate for the form of external digestion that our earliest ancestors used is they watched and waited for fermentation and natural breakdown through fermentation.
So before we learned to cook, we found a way of making food more digestible by leaving it to rot or ferment before we ate it. This means early humans, or hominids to give them their scientific name, might have got a taste for fermented foods very early on.
What we can suggest is that fermentation was part and parcel of making food digestible. And so inevitably, our early ancestors would have had some familiarity with consuming alcohol. Before the onset of agriculture, it's difficult to think of examples whereby one could say they were definitely drinking, but there's a strong physiological argument that they were familiar with alcohol consumption.
The first actual evidence we have of early humans coming together around a fire to eat and drink, or feast, comes from cave sites in East Africa, which Professor Jones thinks would have involved eating fermented foods and beverages.
Probably around 80,000 years ago, there's direct archaeological evidence that we were sitting around facing each other, sharing food and drink in a formalized manner. And you can see that largely because cooking has emerged by that stage. And so you have the fire in the center, which leaves a very good archaeological trace. And it's worth emphasizing that in most species, eye-to-eye contact is quite threatening and hostile, that most mammal species, and even our close relatives, they may share some food, but then they will turn away and eat in private because the place of eye-to-eye contact in other species is one of hostility.
So whilst there's very little physical evidence to go on, we do know that by this point in our history, around 80,000 years ago, we've diverged from our fellow primates because we're cooperating, socializing, and eating and drinking together. Of course, we don't know if these feasts involved alcohol or other intoxicating substances, but Professor Jones thinks it's quite likely.
One of the things that we can say about our species, in contrast even to other Homo species, is we are social feasters in a very communal sense. It is not just about calories and protein and so forth. A lot of it is about social engagement. It also goes with the earliest adornment of the body, the earliest forms of performance and behavior. There's a number of things that go with it that emphasize that the meal is as much a social as a biological thing. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is it's in the context of the meal being a social meeting that in many societies, including our own, the psychoactive element is very important. And I think if we think about those meals of Homo sapiens' own species performing as much of a social function as a nutritional function, we can understand how the psychoactive element isn't an added extra. It's part and parcel of how we perform that meal.
Professor Jones emphasizes that there is, however, a big difference between having a taste for alcohol and actually making it. It might seem obvious, but all forms of alcohol production need some way of keeping everything together in a controlled way. About 11 or 10,000 years ago in southern China, around the Yangtze River, modern humans began to domesticate rice and make pottery. And this might be the biggest clue for understanding why people started to make alcohol.
In this culture called the Shangshan culture, we see There are some jars and bowls and large basins. The function of those pottery had been studied, but this time when we analyzed the pottery, we found evidence of fermentation.
Li Liu is a professor of Chinese archaeology at Stanford University. Her team has been studying archaeobotanical remains, that's ancient seeds and plants, which may show evidence of fermentation. This is indicated by microscopic damages to preserved rice starches found in pottery vessels. However, on this occasion, the team also uncovered something much rarer.
It's called Monascus mold. It's a red color, and it has been used traditionally in China for fermentation, alcoholic fermentation.
During the Neolithic, a warmer and wetter climate allowed this Monascus mold to thrive, and we know from modern case studies that this is a fungi used to produce alcohol as a form of yeast starter for fermentation. A process similar to this may have been used in southern China.
This kind of red molds, the Monascus, is naturally grow on rice. Even today, they use this kind of molds together with the rice to produce the same type of red rice alcohol. So this is just a natural process to turn the moldy rice into alcohol. And I think people observe that. And then they found some moldy leftover rice turn into some flavor, and also their feeling, their mood, and they probably like it. So that's how the people began to copy the natural process. So that is the beginning of alcohol production.
It seems as if this process of making alcohol from fermenting rice was well established in Neolithic southern China by 9000 BCE. Within a window of 2000 years later, Professor Liu's research showed that the method was appearing in other parts of East Asia.
We found several sites using this method along the Yellow River, and that's continued to develop. Farmers began to expand to the west and southwest, like the Tibetan Plateau, because they need more land. And while they're moving, they carry this alcoholic technology with them.
Between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago, pottery vessels used for fermenting rice for alcohol were pretty similar across China, a form known as a globular jar. At some stage, communities in the west and east of China began to develop their own unique variations of alcohol production based on the original rice fermenting process. They also came up with different ways to drink the alcohol, as it took on new meanings and roles in people's lives.
The drinking vessel developed into a diversity of forms. So some are like a pitcher, the pouring the alcohol, and others are like a goblets for drinking. And also you began to see that they were made in a very elaborate way, very high fire temperature pottery and very thin, or they have some kind of special design. So this is telling us this kind of a social hierarchy.
Professor Liu recovered residues of a rice-based alcohol from elaborate drinking cups found in extensive tombs in the east of China, possibly indicating that this form of alcohol consumption was done by wealthy members of a community at the top of the social ladder. And they weren't buried with just one or two cups. Archaeologists found up to 80 in some tombs, suggesting that alcohol was really important in ritual activities such as funerals and ancestral worship. However, the role of alcohol drinking and how it was done was very different in the west of China. Here, the archaeologists found large amphora with strange scratch marks on the rims. They experimented to see what caused the marks and discovered that they were probably made with hollow reeds, which were being used as drinking straws.
It's quite clear that's how they drink. And that kind of a drinking style can still be found in southwest China today. And that kind of drinking method seems to help maintain the group solidarity and probably their cultural identity. The vessels become bigger and bigger. They indicate the group of people join these drinking activities become larger and larger. This also reflect some kind of social connections. And the larger sites tend to have very large houses to hold activities, drinking activities, or very large plaza. And that is suitable for group dancing and drinking and also kind of ritual activities.
Early evidence for alcohol production and consumption shows that people were using it as a form of social lubricant to help maintain communities that were spread out over vast landscapes. This is a similar story to other Neolithic sites across the world. At the monumental site of Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, archaeologists believe they found the chemical signatures for 11,000-year-old beer brewing in great big vats as part of large-scale celebrations. At various sites in the Caucasus Mountains, there's tantalizing evidence of communities using grapes for making wine from about 6000 BCE. Clearly, alcohol was helping bring people together on a regular basis.
Oh, very good.
Very good, yeah. Smells lovely, doesn't it? Yeah. Would you like some wine?
I would love
pour
some.
out? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
no.
Here we go. Let's have a... Oh, it's a lovely colour, that, isn't it?
Very deep red.
Really deep red. So is it only red wines that you get in Georgia, or are they growing various grape types?
Yeah, they've got various grape types.
You might be thinking that this is an excuse to indulge in some delicious Georgian wine at 10 in the morning. But of course, this is all in the interests of research. I'm with Dr. Catherine Longford, an archaeobotanist at the University of Sheffield. Catherine studies the uses of plants in Georgia and the wider Caucasus region. She's been researching early winemaking and thinking about what alcohol meant to people living there in prehistory. So we should probably have a toast, I suppose, for this as well. So what do they say in Georgia? Is it
Gagimajos.
Gagimajos. Excellent. Okay, let's try this then.
Excellent.
Really nice.
Well, this actually feels particularly Georgian because when you come into someone's house, they will greet you with a toast. So whether you're arriving or leaving, they will meet you and pull out their best wine and their best. It's not a huge glass you're having. It's not, the aim isn't to get drunk, but it's just to have the taste and to show that you're welcome. So yeah, having some wine.
So while I was enjoying Dr. Longford's welcoming wine, she told me more about the importance of winemaking in Georgia today and how modern Georgians see it as having deep connections to prehistoric drinking practices.
There was an interesting little figure found at a site called Vani in the Iron Age, so it's about 7th century BC, and he's called the Tamada. It's only small, it's probably 10 centimetres small, made out of bronze, and he's got in his one hand, he's got a drinking horn. And the drinking horn is still used today in traditional supras. One of the things with the drinking horn is that because it's curved, so it's a cow horn or something like that they've hollowed out and decorated, you can never put it down because it's a horn, so you have to drain it. Once you have liquid in it, it has to be drained.
A supra, by the way, is a traditional Georgian special meal.
It's quite an organised structure to it. So the Tamada, they're in charge of sort of proposing the toast, which might start with first toast to God or to peace, and then everyone is expected to drink along with that. And then you'll go through the various toasts they'll have is to the children, to women, to motherhood, to love, to friendship, to the ancestors, and then more specifically to those that have died in the family and things like that. And it's a way of showing connection between the host and the community and the visitors and the guests that are there. In the little village where I work high in the mountains in southwestern Georgia, a village called Sveli, nearly every family will have a little vineyard. It might not be big, but it might just be in their garden. And they will produce their own wine. And this is their special wine that they will bring out for these special occasions, for their supras, for welcoming guests. So yes, Georgians are very, very proud of their winemaking heritage.
Dr. Longford and I have been drinking a dry red wine made in the Kakheti region in Georgia and produced from Saperavi grapes, which is now one of the most widely cultivated varieties in the country. Though this wine is only a few years old, it has its roots in much older traditions.
Georgia has in fact, that area of the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, they have a very unique way of making wine. And in Georgia, it's through the use of the qvevri, and in Armenia, they call it the karas. And it's using large earthen vessels inset into the ground and fermenting mashed up grape and grape products in that, letting the fermentation occur underground, and then sealing it off to allow the wine to mature. And so that's Qvevri winemaking, and it's been recognised by UNESCO as a piece of intangible cultural heritage, and that was marked in 2013. And the Qvevri winemaking in Georgia now is having a resurgence. So a lot of the vineyards are installing new Qvevris. Now these Qvevris, it's not a small undertaking. Some of them, to clean them, you have to actually physically get inside them because they can hold, several thousand litres worth of wine. So it's hugely important to the Georgians, and it is an interesting way of making wine.
Potential wine residues have been found in the region dating to about 6000 BCE, made by small farming communities. These aren't the oldest wine residues in the world, but notably, they've been found in vessels strikingly similar to the Qvevri or Karas.
It could be that they were making the wine in these ceramics, but at least they were being stored in these ceramics. That's what we know for sure. There are other vessels found at other Neolithic sites nearby where we have these large whole-mouth vessels. So they're circular, big openings at the top that have like these applique, what could be grape patterns. They look like triangular dots, which could be bunches of grapes. So there's potential that all these whole-mouth vessels were containing some kind of grape juice, maybe wine.
But Dr. Longford points out that we need to be cautious in suggesting that this proves that winemaking was taking place, or if these processes share any similarities with winemaking in the Caucasus region today. However, at one site in Armenia, archaeologists found surprising evidence of how one community was making and using a wine-like liquid. The site, Arini 1, is in the Armenian mountains inside a deep cave system. The researchers found strange clay structures which they believed might be grape-crushing floors and fermenting vessels, and inside them, residues revealing tartaric acid and a plant pigment found in red grapes. But this wasn't all.
Now, what makes this site even more extraordinary is around these circular crushing platforms, I call them, they've found 3 skulls. So you've got 3 juvenile skulls. One was aged about of a child of 15, and the other 2, there was one 11 and one 8. And they were in sort of somehow embedded in circular clay structures around this crushing platform. So here you've got a really intriguing mix of human remains and a grape liquid. Now we could call it wine. You've got tartaric acid. Could also call it vinegar. So you've got some maybe preserving liquid. We don't really know what's going on, but potentially there's ritual activity, we could say. So at Arini Cave, you could be having a mix of the wine and the sacred or ritual. Something extraordinary is going on in that cave.
The evidence at the Arini 1 cave site suggests that vast quantities of a wine-like liquid were being used for various purposes, and that one of these was closely aligned with death and burial. Since the Neolithic, wine was constantly taking on new meanings by the various communities that were making and consuming it. In some cases, experts think they might have been organising their whole year around it.
Wine, by virtue of its properties, I think for any community that decides to include it in the substances it consumes, is a very special liquid.
Tanya Valamotti is a professor of prehistoric archaeology at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki.
I am an archaeobotanist, and I study the relationship of humans and plants, how people manage the landscape, the vegetation, how they cooked, how they stored things, how they grew plants, and how they used them.
Since the 1990s, Professor Valamotti has been working with a team on researching early wine production at a Neolithic settlement in northern Greece, Tikilitash, which was occupied for thousands of years into the Bronze Age and later.
The village was inhabited by people who were farming and keeping animals like sheep and goats, and they were involved in a wide range of activities like cultivation of crops. It was a well-connected village with places further north in the Balkans and in the wider area of northern Greece, in the North Aegean. as we can tell from things that were brought from elsewhere.
However, in 4300 BCE, a dramatic destructive event took place in Tikilitash. Professor Valamotti and the excavation team uncovered evidence of an extensive fire which burnt a number of village houses down. While this may have been unfortunate for the community living there, the fire preserved the site to a degree not normally witnessed by archaeologists. And it's here in House 1 that Professor Valamotti and her team found the remains of a large-scale wine-making process.
We were able to have a very clear picture of what was going on in every part of the house. This allowed us to see that within the house, people had stored many crops from the fields and the wilderness. And among these finds, there was a huge concentration of charred grape pips and grape pressings. By a huge concentration, it's over 5,000 pips. In association with a smashed coarse pot, its walls were impregnated by a liquid that was rich in tartaric acid.
Professor Valamotti's team realised they were looking at a moment in time when grapes were being collected, processed, and fermented on a large scale. Charred grape pips that looked like they came from wild rather than domesticated grapes, and pressed grape skins, which often contain wild yeasts, had been preserved right next to large jars filled with residues of grape juices.
The house was full of the harvest. The people had not had time to eat up all the stored crops. And fermentation was taking place. So imagining you would harvest your grapes in October and then wait for a couple of months for fermentation to take place. The burning of the house might have happened sometime in winter before the wine was opened up to be consumed. We have also found in the same house drinking cups made of clay and serving vessels. So if we connect the archaeobotanical remains, the pressed grapes, the courseware jar, but also the serving equipment with the jars and the drinking cups, which are quite small, then we have a whole know-how of how to produce an alcoholic beverage, but also we have the necessary equipment that you would use to consume it.
Professor Valamotti knew from the other archaeobotanical remains that the grapes had been collected and processed at a specific point in the year, a seasonal harvest. And together with the drinking paraphernalia, she thinks that this doesn't just represent a moment when communities were using alcohol as part of regular get-togethers, but actively planning for it, anticipating it, and making preparations the year round.
I imagine that the consumption of the wine would have been a very special event. I also imagine that it would have happened once a year when they would have opened the new wine. In this context, people would have consumed it, perhaps having a very big party that they would remember until the next time this was going to take place. I do not think this Neolithic wine was a wine that was drunk on a daily basis. I think it marked the special occasions in the village's life, its inhabitants, but also it might have held a significant position for the wider region. So the party might have involved the arrival of guests from a wider area, from many, many villages.
Professor Valamotti thinks that the site's rare window into Neolithic winemaking by a small village represents something fundamental about how people thought about alcohol in the Bronze Age and beyond.
We tend to associate wine with the emergence of elites, but based on the archaeobotanical evidence we have from prehistoric Greece, from the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, it seems that wine is a substance that can be manipulated by elites in a way that will underline social inequality and status. But per se, on its own, it's not a substance that will lead to social inequality because it has an element that works in the opposite direction, making the community feel they belong, generating a sense of belonging when you consume in common a substance that will loosen inhibitions and break perhaps the social etiquette.
The story of Dikili Tash tells us that wine was a crucial part of life in the ancient world, both as a component in helping people come together, but also to define times in the year and shape their beliefs away from powerful elite rulers. There are clearly many ways that alcohol played a part in getting people to settle down. However, our trip around the world over tens of thousands of years has shown us that alcohol wasn't just an intoxicating drink, but an important, active ingredient in helping people structure their worldviews, form communities, and maintain connections. Would it be too big to say it was integral to shaping what it meant to be human? Professor Jones again.
In any particular society, people will have a sense of which foods to eat, which processes are good, and also which psychoactives are acceptable and which are not. So one thing I would say is we need to get outside our own idea of what we are as human beings. So in my idea of being a human being as a 21st century person is I think about the body as a physical thing and the mind as something separate. So food for the body and food for the mind are in different categories. We mustn't presume that that boundary between feeding the body and feeding the mind existed in all societies, and we have to keep an open mind on that.
That was Professor Martin Jones from the University of Cambridge, ending our first moment in our 5.5 moments when alcohol shaped the world. Your narrator was my colleague, Dr. Nick Groat. I'm Professor Phil Withington, and I'm just fascinated by the idea that humans originally sat down together more than 80,000 years ago and started communicating with each other because of fermentation. It's also striking that once archaeological remains begin to survive, traces of fermentation keep cropping up. It seems alcohol really was instrumental in people coming together and settling down. That's quite a moment to start off with. Our next moment will be considerably shorter. In episode 2, Nick will discuss with Professor Mary Beard and other classicists how wine became embedded in the everyday lives of Greeks and Romans, and how it was used to expand their networks, influence people throughout the Mediterranean, and promote cultural identity. Do listen. It's a fascinating insight into how one product can shape an empire.